This meeting is being recorded.
Cool.
This meeting is being recorded.
So good afternoon. I'm Josh Nelson, the Rabbinic Intern at Kehilat Hanahar for just a little bit longer. And I would like to welcome you to Which Jew? I will have a slideshow that I will share shortly. But first, let's start with a blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So this session is a little bit of a follow-up to the session I did earlier this year, which was entitled Which Israel? And also a bit all on its own. There we go. And so, which Jew? Mapping the spectrums of Judaic cultures from antiquity to today, I promise they will not be super very long to cover such a broad amount of time. Before we get going into the different things we'll look at, I want to start with a list of points of departure, and I'm grateful to Abraham for coming up with these in the first place. But these many points of departure are ways to distinguish between one Jewish group and another, and also one's connection to various Jewish groups. How much you value your own individuality versus group membership, how much you have, how much you hold that customs should be only as inherited, and how much you believe they should be made new. Is Torah given by God or written by humans? Is halakha firm and fixed, or is it flexible? These many questions, as well as questions of region, language, and ethnicity, are ways that the Jewish people have been divided up in one way or another through the millennia. So in the beginning, we're not starting with Bereshit, but rather the divided monarchy, the time when there was a kingdom of Judah, Judeans, and the kingdom of Israel. And the Israelites were carted off by Assyria in 722 BCE, but not all of them appear to have been carted off. There are still some people in a group called Samaritans. They've lived near Mount Gerizim for over 2,000 years. They don't call themselves Jewish for most of that history, but recently they've started to. Their sacred literature is very limited compared to the rest of Judaism. They only have the Torah and the book of Joshua, and their book of Joshua is very different from ours. But the current population of Samaritans is around 850, so it's a very small group now. It used to be larger, but it has decreased in size over the generations, and especially since the modern state of Israel, making it much more possible for Samaritans to integrate into broader Israeli culture. Several of them have undergone formal conversion. But the Samaritans, they're a group that starts maybe as early as 722, maybe a little bit later, but they are one of the oldest Jewish groups who hasn't really moved from where they currently live. They have some unique practices for Passover. They still make Passover sacrifices of lambs. And we'll see a bit more on the Samaritans in just a moment. So after the divided monarchy and the exile, when the Second Temple has been rebuilt, we end up with 4 philosophies. Josephus, the historian, writes about this. And the 4 philosophies, you have the Sadducees, the Sadducees, you might have heard the name, which are really the priests and people aligned with them. We have the Perushim, the Pharisees, who are the proto-rabbis. We don't really have rabbis quite yet, but they're getting close. And that is the group that will become rabbis and become dominant after the fall of the Second Temple. We have the Essenes, bless them, who lived in Qumran on the Dead Sea. They had strange practices. They were very ascetic. And they are beloved in archaeology because they stored a bunch of their old scrolls in clay jars before they put them in their geniza near the Dead Sea where it's very dry. Those scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, were recovered starting in the 1940s, 1950s especially, and have revolutionized our understanding of that period of Jewish history. So after the Essenes, we also have the Zealots, who were violent and militant, resistant to the Roman Empire. One particular group was basically called the Daggers because of the number of assassinations that they did. So the 4 philosophies, the Zealots are the least philosophy-minded of them, their philosophy being kick out the Romans. So in the Second Temple period, we have 4 different strains of Judaism, or proto-Judaism if you prefer, going at the same time. So our modern differences have basis in our history. And here is a bit about the Samaritans today, a bit more. You can see their distinctive dress. This is during a Passover celebration. The gentleman in the middle holding the Torah scroll aloft. On the left of the screen, I have a Torah scroll. And there's a close-up on the right. And if you look closely, you can see that it does not look like the Hebrew that you know, although there might be a letter or two. I see a pei that look similar, that look the same. These differences, the Samaritan script is very old and is descended from the same Proto-Hebrew script that our Hebrew script is today, but it took its own path of descent. So moving from the Second Temple period into Rabbinic Judaism, there is a little hiccup trying to move smoothly through time because we have the group called the Karaites. They're non-Rabbinic Jews. They have disputed and possibly multiple origins, might be multiple groups that formed at different times and conglomerated together in the Middle Ages. But a common factor in those early groups is that they rejected the authority of the rabbis and the Talmud, the oral Torah. Karaite Jews were at one point about 10% of the world's Jews. Their golden age was from 900 to 1100, and they had a lot of power in certain Jewish communities, and there were a lot of disputes between rabbinic groups and Karaite groups, but also in the style of Romeo and Juliet, apparently a lot of intermarriage, as we know from the Cairo Geniza. There are records of Karaite and Rabbinic Jews intermarrying, and their ketubot are slightly different. And so there's some blended ketubot that have parts of both traditions, which is a very interesting thing to know, that in the history of the Jewish people, we have included people who are not Rabbinic Jews and called them Jews and intermarried with them. The largest communities historically were in Egypt and then later in Crimea. The picture here is of Ukrainian Karaites with an unknown date. Their garb looks very similar to what you might find in all sorts of other Jewish groups in that overall region around the Black Sea and into the Mideast. And a couple of the essential Karaite differences with Rabbinic Judaism. I have a picture of a Karaite synagogue from Ramla. And if you notice, there are no seats in the synagogue. Their prayers, they do standing up and kneeling, similar to the way that prayers are done in Islam. Another key difference is that the Karaites insist on a literal reading of the Torah, the Peshat, the plain meaning of the text. And they take the Peshat to be the basis of their practice, of their laws. And it's very interesting that they're very, very much the literal meaning until they come across some point where they disagree with Rabbinic Jews, like tefillin. Karaites do not wear tefillin, the phylacteries on the arm and on head. And regarding the verse that says, keep it on your between your eyes and in your hand, they say that verse, that is surely metaphorical. So it's just interesting how they have a different point of view on what should be viewed as metaphor and what should be taken as literal. Karaites follow patrilineal descent, whereas Rabbinic Judaism traditionally has followed matrilineal descent since the time of the early rabbis. The idea of patrilineal descent or bilineal descent, descent through either parent, is coming back into fashion among American Jews. The Reform movement and the Reconstruction movement both recognize patrilineal Jews as full Jews and admit them to rabbinical school without requiring conversion. I believe the conservative movement is still on the side of a patrilineal Jew would require a formal perfunctory conversion. And another point which one of my colleagues at rabbinical school really enjoys is they have a different understanding of kashrut. Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. They take very literally. So some of them, not all of them, but some of them will actually eat cheeseburgers as long as the meat is kosher and the cheese is kosher. So that is one of the draws of that Karaite Jews sort of jokingly, but also sort of realistically offer as an alternative to Rabbinic Judaism is you can read the Torah, you can figure out what it says, you can eat a cheeseburger. If you would like to visit them, the nearest one, Congregation B'nai Yisrael, is in Daly City, California. Otherwise, they're mostly in Israel. And if you want to learn more about Karaites specifically, they have a website, karaites.org, where they teach and have a lot more information on their practices. Did you have a question, Abraham? Okay. So moving into Rabbinic Judaism and the many, many divisions therein. The first division that we have in Rabbinic Judaism is really in the medieval period. We have the division into Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Sepharad is the Hebrew word for Spain or that area of the world at that time. Ashkenaz for Germany. And so it was the ones on the far western end of Europe and the ones in Central Europe, but we now would call Western Europe, but still. The Sephardim began in Muslim-ruled lands, as well as Italy and Greece. So not just Spain, but all through North Africa and around all the way up into Turkey. So basically on the Mediterranean was where the Sephardim came from. The Ashkenazim were in Christian-ruled lands at the time where the distinction started to be made. Sephardim ultimately ended up speaking Ladino. In an earlier era, Judeo-Arabic was much more common, whereas Ashkenazim used Yiddish. One of the simplest and most common pointed out differences, Sephardim are pro-kitniot on Pesach, with rice, corn, beans, like legumes of all sorts. They eat them on Pesach, whereas Ashkenazi custom is to not eat the kitniot on Pesach. And Rambam, Maimonides, was a Sephardic Jew, Rashi, an Ashkenazic Jew. So two of our biggest thinkers in medieval Jewish history and commenters on, Rashi commented on the whole Torah, almost the whole Tanakh, the whole Talmud. They were on different ends of the Jewish world at the time, which their behavior wasn't that different at the time, but distinctions started to be made and started to grow. Sephardic Jews, their golden age was in Andalusia. Around the time that the Karaite Jewish civilization golden age started decreasing is when the Andalusian golden age really began. And their experience is very colored by what happened in 1492, 1496, 1497, when they were expelled from Spain and Portugal as Christians came in and expelled the Muslim rulers as well, reconquered the area, and shortly thereafter kicked the Jews out. And so Sephardim spread throughout North Africa and Middle East, and because it was after 1492, a number of them went to the Americas. The first Jewish synagogue in the United States was a Sephardi synagogue. And one note of history that was not an accident, modern Hebrew was intentionally designed using Sephardi pronunciation because it was the language that was heard in the streets among Jews who lived in what was called Palestine at the time that modern Hebrew was being formed. And here's a Sephardi couple in traditional dress from Sarajevo in 1900. The tall conical hat is something that, if you remember, you saw back with the Samaritans as well. You find it in a number of Sephardi dresses as well. So here's a map. The text is not as clear as it could be, I'm sorry, but of the different regions that Jews lived and how they got named the different groups they were in. So orange is Sephardi, blue is Ashkenazi, and they overlap in France, in Romania area, in the UK as well. Red, centered in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, are Mizrahi. Also the Jews who lived in Syria and Jordan, many of them ended up being viewed as Mizrahi as well. We'll get to Mizrahi in just a minute. And green is the many smaller groups. We have Ethiopia, Yemen, India, China. We'll talk about all of those in just a few minutes as well. So Mizrahi Jews, what are they? They are Eastern Jews. Mizrahi means Eastern. Jews who lived in North Africa and the Middle East. And there's a significant overlap with Sephardi identity and practices. Judeo-Arabic was much more common with them. The term was coined with the founding of the State of Israel. And with the founding of Israel, there was also an expulsion of the Mizrahi Jews from Arab and Muslim states. So the Mizrahi Jews are broken down into two subdivisions. Mashriki, from the Mashriq region, which is Egypt through Iran, includes Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, and Yemen. And the Maghrebi, which is Northern Africa, Algeria, Libya, Morocco, and Tunisia. So the Mizrahi Jews are in some ways Sephardi Jews because the Sephardim integrated with the Mizrahi Jews wherever they moved to. And the two identities are not really distinct, but there are some distinctions that they will make with themselves, particularly about which political parties they're willing to vote for in Israeli elections. Is one of the key distinctions between someone who might be Mizrahi and someone who's a pure Sephardi. And are many diverse and isolated communities. And I say isolated because a lot of these communities had limited or no contact with the rest of the Jewish world after their founding for anywhere from centuries to perhaps a couple millennia in one case. And many of them claim descent from the biblical era. For example, the 10 lost tribes, since the Assyrians exiled the people, carted them off to Assyria, which is modern day Iraq, Iran area, and then spread them out through the Assyrian Empire. It is completely possible that there were people, members of the Jewish people, who were founding members of these communities from the 10 lost tribes. It is also completely possible that it was a bunch of Jews who were merchants who ended up settling in a particular area for some reason or another and adopted the idea that they were from the 10 lost tribes as they gradually settled into that area and intermarried, because Jews in every age and every place have intermarried with non-Jews, and Jews look like every sort of human under the sun where they've been because they have that intermarriage. There's a picture on the right of Kaifeng Jews from China, and many of these diverse communities disappeared over time or assimilated into other non-Jewish groups, especially in China. Muslim groups especially absorbed several Jewish communities in the last 300 to 500 years. And the locals in that area, their writings describe Jews and Muslims as being virtually identical, except the Jews, quote, pluck the sinews out. They would not eat the sinews in the thigh because of Jacob being struck in the hip. So in Kaifeng, Jewish practice did in fact die out and left remnants. There are some stelas. There are Torah scrolls now stored in the UK. These 3 stelas testify to the strength of this Jewish community in the 1400s and the 1500s. And a few of the known descendants of Kaifeng Jews have taken up Jewish practice again. There are about 20 of them who are currently in Israel, and I think a few dozen to a few hundred who are seriously considering the process of adopting Jewish practice and making Aliyah. So as well, we have Indian Jews. B'nai Yisrael is just one of the many. B'nai Yisrael adopted normative rabbinic practice in the 1800s from Cochin Jews, which are another Indian Jewish group, but a bit smaller, so I don't have a slide for them. B'nai Yisrael immigrated to Israel very near the founding of the state. And there was a whole lot of controversy over whether they are or were really Jews, despite having rabbinic practice because of their dark skin, in part. There was an official ruling by the Rabbinut, the Israeli chief rabbinate, that they are in fact Jews, no conversion needed. They are just Jewish. There's around 6,500 of them today, or 65,000, sorry, of them today. Most of those in Israel. There's still some in India. And on the left, I have a picture of 2 school teachers from 1856 who are members of the B'nai Yisrael community. Notice the headgear, notice the dress with the sash and the coat, just being a common element of Jewish dress in the Middle Ages, and then continuing on toward the modern era, that was lost in Ashkenazi culture earlier than the rest. As well, we have Beta Yisrael, Ethiopian Jews. Their language is Ge'ez rather than Hebrew, and Hebrew literacy is still extremely low among the Beta Yisrael who live in Israel. Their practice is called Haymanot. It is a mixture of Talmudic and non-Talmudic Judaism, so some rabbinic, some non, and they have a different set of sacred texts than most Jews. They share it with an Ethiopian Orthodox Church, what they consider to be the core of the Bible, which includes the Torah for them, and especially, I believe, Ruth, Jonah, and some of the other prophets that we read on holidays, actually, are part of their sacred literature. They have had profound and prolonged difficulty integrating into Israeli society because they are not halakhically Jewish in the Ashkenazi or Sephardi understanding of what it would mean to be halakhically Jewish. There's also some controversy over whether or not they can marry a Jew without formal conversion. There's some who say yes and some who say no among the Orthodox rabbinate. So there's a wide range of approaches to them. There's around 175,000 of them today. 160,000 or so live in Israel. Most of the rest are in Ethiopia, and a small amount in the United States. And here you see a kahen, as they would call a Kohen, a priest. celebrating one of the holidays that they celebrate that we do not traditionally. I'm going to mispronounce it, but I believe it's Sajd or Sagd. And you see the colorful dress on top of the plain white, and the gentleman behind the colorful umbrellas that they're holding as shade from the sun. And Beta Israel is gradually integrating with Orthodox Judaism in Israel. There are many Orthodox rabbis from Beta Israel or people in the process of studying to become Orthodox rabbis from them. And so it's expected that in a few generations, they will just have been blended into the rest of Israeli society for the most part, and probably have lost several of their distinctive practices, which is in some opinions good, in some opinions bad. Are you more interested in Jewish unity or Jewish diversity? Because both are required. Looking to the Americas, the movements, American Judaism is especially characterized by the different movements. It's less so around the world. The Reform movement that came out of German Reform, the American Reform movement, when they formed Hebrew Union College in 1875 and issued the Pittsburgh Platform, their first common, this is what we agree to as our Jewish principles as Reformed Jews in the United States. At that point, the American Reform movement and the German Reform movement were functionally split. The German Reform movement continued to develop and is somewhere in the liberal end of Jewish practice. Those that managed to survive the Shoah or return after the Shoah have been generally somewhere leaning a bit more towards what we would identify as conservative Judaism, trying to take a pragmatic middle path. Orthodoxy wasn't actually the original Rabbinic Judaism. It formed specifically as a reaction to Reform Judaism in Germany and in the United States. And there are many different formations, many different Orthodox groups. They emphasized that we're going to maintain, hold, and return to our traditions in a reactionary sort of way. And their impulse to save rather than move toward modernity is really what made them come into being. Conservative Judaism looked at this, looked at that clash and went, there's a middle path between you two. They founded the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1886. It's called the Masorti movement outside the US, Canada, and Israel. And we'll get into a little bit about what makes them different from the others in a second. Reconstructionist movement, which I'm quite familiar with. I hope many of you are as well, being that this is a Reconstructionist shul. In any case, Mordecai Kaplan's ideas, Ira Eisenstein is really responsible for getting RRC going and getting the movement going as a whole. Kaplan's son-in-law. Kaplan didn't want it to be a movement. Eisenstein did. And Eisenstein put in the work. And so we have a movement. And I have a rabbinical school. So humanistic Judaism was founded in 1963 or 1965, not 1964 though. There's just some questions on exactly which year it was, but it's one of those two. They are very focused on secular humanism, but doing it Jewishly and figuring out exactly what that means. They are non-theistic, so that means that atheists are welcome, but it doesn't mean that the movement necessarily takes an atheist-specific stance. But they focus very heavily on human development, on finding what they can out of Jewish tradition that would support humanism. And last but not least, and there are certainly others beyond these, is the renewal movement in the 60s and 70s. Renewal and Reconstructionist Judaism are very close together in a lot of respects. There are several recon rabbis who are identified as founders of the renewal movement. And there are several renewal tunes that are now regarded as, well, that was always a Reconstructionist tune in many congregations, even though it came from a renewal community. The thing that renewal brings is they infuse their Judaism with Kabbalah and Hasidic practices, as well as practices from other spiritualities, Buddhism, Sufism, and their Aleph ordination program. It is hard to pin a precise date on when it began because of how it began. Zalman Schachter Shlomi, their founding rabbi, started doing personal training and private ordination at the beginning before it became a more concrete rabbinical program. So having an exact starting date is not easy to find for that rabbinical school. So in the realm of orthodoxy, there are 3 basic divisions in the United States, maybe 4. And in Israel, there are also 3, but they would argue with me that there are much more than 3, because Haredi Jews have a strict adherence to halakha as handed down from the previous generations. The Torah is divine law given in perfection to Moses on Sinai. And the Hasidim are functionally Haredim with extra Kabbalah thrown in. That minimizes some differences, but also it explains a lot of their worldview overlapping at the same time. They limit engagement with the modern world. Some of them actually live basically in isolated compounds that they rarely leave. And both Haredi and Hasidic Jews, there are several subgroups with very strong differences of opinion following one Rebbe or one rabbi over another. And those different groups may see themselves as distinct as a Reconstructionist and a Hasidic Jew might see themselves as distinct from a. Let me start over. They might see themselves as distinct enough from each other as I, a Reconstructionist, might see myself as distinct from their practice. So they are. I don't want to say feisty or fierce, but those are the words that are coming to me about their piety, their practice, and their devotions. Modern Orthodox is pragmatic-minded as well. They are more traditionally oriented than conservative Judaism. The idea of keeping traditional halakha while engaging with the modern world is important to them. One of my instructors actually identifies as a modern Orthodox Jew. So they are like conservative movement, but heavier on the idea. And especially in Israel, religious Zionism is a major subgroup of modern Orthodox. and we'll talk about Israelis in just a minute. So my favorite question, which comes from the Seder, Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halilot? Why is this night different from all other nights? Well, why is this movement different from all other movements? So I have a chart here that I won't go over completely, but there's the basic differences: humanist Judaism or secular humanism. Reform has ethical monotheism as their core principle. The idea that our Jewish tradition teaches us ethics and monotheism, and now we get to decide what we do with that. And Jewish law is not binding; it's personal interpretation and choice. Renewal brings in a lot of spirituality and music and mysticism into their practice. Reconstructionists, Kaplan's idea of the evolving religious civilization. Halakha is a valuable resource. The famous quote, "It has a vote, but not a veto." So we in the room take it seriously, and we give it a vote, and we also decide how many votes we have in the room, whether we want to outnumber it or not, which is how we have a vote but not a veto, how Halakha has a vote but not a veto. Conservative Jews, the movement has a historical critical approach, which informs its stance on Halakha and its openness to change. Torah being a partnership between God and people, specifically the rabbis of the day, is an important idea for them. It's how they justified their halakhic changes to themselves primarily, but also to the Jewish world as a whole. Although in the more traditional elements, halakhic changes are not acceptable, and in the more liberal elements, their halakhic changes are not quite far enough or fast enough. And kashrut in theory, but in practice, many conservative Jews, their day-to-day practice looks very much like a Reconstructionist or a Reform Jew in how they live their lives Jewishly. But they hold their rabbis to a higher standard. And that is something that they value is that in theory it's an important thing, even if people don't always remember that kashrut is an important thing when they're ordering pizza for the children's event and get pepperoni and don't even think of why. Which that personal anecdote, but the conservative movement also has had a difficult time defining itself and its theology. An attempt was made in the 1980s, but not really before, because it has this range of practice from what resembles Orthodox to what resembles Reform, and this range of beliefs. It's hard to pin down exactly what it is, but thoroughly American Judaism. Conservative Judaism is thoroughly American Judaism. It really began to explode after World War I. It was the dominant sort of practice as a acceptable middle path for Jews who served in the American Army. And that is how the movement really got going as strong as it has been in our American Jewish history. Modern Orthodox, as I said, balanced tradition and modernity. They are open to some changes. There are now female Orthodox rabbis. They're all modern Orthodox or open Orthodox, which is a newer branch out from modern Orthodox. And some of them use the title rabbi, some use maharat, some use rabbah, and they are in the process of sorting out exactly how they are going to function as a group of female Orthodox rabbis, because they now have a very strong school and several classes of graduates. And so there are women who are committed to having an Orthodox Jewish life and being a rabbi and making it work. And in the past, that would send them to the conservative movement. But now it is a possibility because of modern orthodoxies open to change. Haredi and Hasidim are very similar, as I said. And Hasidim, the one thing I want to add is that Lurianic Kabbalah in particular is very important to them. The Kabbalah of Isaac Luria from Tzfat in the 1600s, if I remember right. The Hasidic tales also are a feature that they have that is much beloved throughout the Jewish world. So in Israel, the Haredim are about 8%, but they are the fastest growing. Dati, religious Jews in Israel, around 12%. They're generally Orthodox Jews. Hiluni are secular Jews, about 45% of Israelis. But most of them aren't truly secular. They observe some Jewish ritual, especially life cycle events, major holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Pesach. But you probably won't find them in shul on Shabbat. And when given a choice, they have a general, sometimes very strong preference for Orthodox rabbis. And between Dati and Hiloni are the Masorti, which is not the Masorti of conservative Judaism. The two terms are just used differently. About 33% of the population, and Mizrahi Jews in particular often identify as Masorti. As Mizrahi Jews and Sephardi Jews never really divided into movements the way that Ashkenazi did, because they weren't confronted with modernity in the same way. And so there's more of a spectrum without making hard distinctions between someone who practices very traditionally and keeps as many of the halakot as someone who is a Haredi, and someone who is on the very edge. They see themselves as all supporting and identifying with the tradition in some way. As well, in Israel, there's a small community of progressive and liberal religious Jews. Anecdotally, I know one who's described themselves as Dati Hiloni, just to confuse everyone, or Hiloni Dati. I'm religiously secular or secularly religious, which fails to get the point across at all. They're few and far between. There's only 40 communities, which is up about 10 communities in the last decade. And they're fighting for equality and recognition by the Rabbinic. There was a major celebration in the Reform movement, because they're generally allied with the Reform movement, when the first liberal synagogue in Israel got state funding the way that Orthodox synagogues do, because it was a very long, difficult struggle to get that recognition. And it was a woman rabbi, which I'm sure upset some of the traditionalists much more than if it had been a man. But it was the only religious community in a particular area, and so that's how they forced the rabbinate to recognize them. And since then, they've been trying to push and grow, because there is among Hiloni Jews a number of people who would identify as progressive or liberal religious Jews if they had a community, if they had really a social opportunity to do so. And that is not as common. So back to where we began, our points of departure. Individuality and group membership, national and religious identity, religious versus secular Jewish identity, all these different identities, all these different practices really divide up the Jewish people in complex ways, and ways that although I've portrayed it as fairly simple, it's actually pretty complicated to figure out exactly where someone might lie, especially if they are a patrilineal Jew of Ashkenazi descent, who are very enthralled by Sephardic practice and Sephardic traditions. Which of the Jewish identities do they hold? It's all of the above. And so each one of us has our own stance on these many different issues. And so when we say, I'm Jewish, what do we mean by that? Which Jewish, which Jew, which segments of the Jewish experience? I have been talking to people who identify as Jewish who haven't been in a synagogue since their Brit Milah. But they identify as culturally Jewish. There are Jews who, like myself, came into this people from outside, and the identities that I hold are different because I don't have a Ashkenazi or Sephardi family. I don't have family traditions. I've been creating them, not making them up as I go, but deliberately and consciously creating them as I've moved through Jewish life. Trying to find a balance that works for me. Because if I can't inherit a custom from my family, well, where do I inherit it from? I have some customs I've adopted from some of the rabbis I've studied with, and some that I've adopted due to interactions with other Jews around the Shabbat table. So with these many questions of departure, points of departure, questions of Jewish identity, the idea of being inclusive or exclusivistic, halakha, when someone says, I'm Jewish, which Jewish do they mean? And how important is it to find out? One of my favorite memories from the synagogue where I did my conversion is realizing that the most atheistic Reform Jew and the most Orthodox-leaning Reformodox Jew were both in front of me side by side praying together. And it really encapsulated in that moment the breadth of acceptable Jewish tradition. The idea that an atheist Jew can pray and meditate and be there and support a Reformadox Jew who is there praying and supporting the atheistic Jew really warmed my heart in the moment and still does today. The distinctions in Jewish identity don't matter as much sometimes, especially when we think about Jewish unity in the light of anti-Semitism and oppression, because we're all Jewish, and Jewish hatred doesn't target any particular Jewish group, it targets them all. So, given that large breadth, I'm happy to return to a slide if anyone has a question about anything. But I'm going to go ahead, Abraham.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think this presentation is masterful. It really is. It's really giving us a very concise organization of the state of this history, which is far more complicated than we ordinarily think of. And I'm happy that we have this recorded because it needs to be revisited and understood. It'll become a teaching tool for us for the future, and I thank you for that. Now, what I see coming out of this is in my own research in delving in and trying to make sense of things. I know that the Hasidim and all flavors of them, and they don't respect each other necessarily, have this concern for loss through assimilation, which is certainly a reality. But
yes,
the underlying problem, the way I understand it, is that we like to think that our thoughts are correct. We think they're right. And who among us says, my thoughts are wrong?
The most mature and wise are the ones who are able to say that.
Yeah, but the problem goes on that that sets up, says, I'm right, you're wrong. And that creates the problem of getting along. In that whole list of from soup to nuts in the Jewish spectrum, who respects who? The liberals will say, okay, I will tolerate you guys on the right, but the ones on the right say, you're not Jews.
Yeah.
So we have this ongoing problem.
Yeah. I am intending on being in Israel this summer with RRC's summer program. And I fully expect to be walking down the street and see people who I would call Jews. Yeah. And know that if they got to know me, they would say that I'm not Jewish at all.
Yeah.
Despite being in rabbinical school. That's
a shanda.
Yeah, and there's hope in me that might change in the future.
Yeah.
But also concerned that perhaps it won't change at all in the future. Yeah. That American Judaism, with its different movements, especially Reform, conservative movements, especially those. Reconstructionists were smaller. That there's a fear that we're just assimilating slowly, and we will cease to be Jewish. There won't be a liberal American Jewish community in the future. Which I think is a valid fear, but also I think it sells ourselves short, because in a Reconstructionist synagogue, in a conservative synagogue, in a Reform synagogue, you can have Orthodox minyanim and liberal minyanim praying in separate spaces and in some cases together.
Mhm.
And despite their theological differences, trying to figure out how to make that work together is a project I know that several synagogues are undertaking to figure out how we can have a tent that people who would call me not Jewish can come daven and perhaps change their mind about my Jewishness in their minds.
On a personal level, Josh, I really have a lot of hope, and especially for your situation, because what you bring to the table is a quality of scholarship that for more rational minds will listen.
And I have one person in the room with me, Anita.
Where does the Chabad community
W-
kind of fall?
Where does Chabad fall in this? Chabad is interesting. They are one of the few, perhaps the only evangelical Jewish organization, but they evangelize other Jews. They want to promote Orthodox practice. They are Chabadniks are in some ways still very much part of, and somewhat an offshoot of Hasidic practice, and I wish I could remember which one, but I'm blanking off the top of my head. But they are one of the few groups where if one of their vans where they drive around in certain areas and try to help Jews who look like me do some Orthodox practices, like put on tefillin and do the daily prayers. If I came up to them and said I'm Jewish, they would certainly work with me, no questions asked.
Right.
And it would only be after I was like coming to their community that the rabbi would sit down with me and figure out, are you Jewish or are you Jewish?
Yeah, and they're also associated with a lot of educational institutions, so
Yeah.
access to younger.
They're in a lot of colleges as well.
Yeah.
Chabad and Hillel are in direct competition in a lot of colleges.
Yeah.
Barbara.
Thank you so much, Josh. That answered a lot of questions for me. And yeah, anyway, I'll just jump into my question. Like, what would happen if you wanted to make Aliyah to Israel? Would you have to go through a process? Like, there's real kind of strict law of return.
Currently, I would have to present my conversion certificate, and that would actually be sufficient because I converted with an American rabbi in an American shul, according to the American standards. That is sufficient for the Israeli law of return as it currently stands. Presuming that this current Israeli government does not collapse on itself, which it seems to be threatening to do perpetually, I don't know what the law of return will say in 2 or 3 years. If they will make the changes that they're talking about restricting it to Orthodox conversions in the United States, about restricting it to clearly matrilineal Jews, descendants of Orthodox practicing Jews. There's a number of different proposals I've heard that would make it so that I would be disqualified. But as the law currently is, I would be qualified.
I think the beard helps, frankly.
The beard does help. The beard really does help. I've had people come up to me in the kosher section of grocery stores before because they see how I dress. They know that I'm not an Orthodox Jew in the flavor that they probably are looking for, but I'm probably a knowledgeable Jew. And they ask me all sorts of strange questions about the food available, or is this hechsher this or that. They just presume because of the beard that I must be a more traditionally minded Jew and not a Reconstructionist.
Heaven forbid you should wear a yarmulke, and then it's nailed.
I mean,
Oh, you do?
I
Okay.
wear one. I wear
Oh.
one every day, all the
Wow.
time. So yeah, I visibly Jewish, and it always surprises and sometimes amuses me who comes up and asks me a question, or goes out of their way to say Shabbat Shalom on a Friday afternoon grocery run. As I'm studiously looking at my cart, making sure that the non-kosher items are at least somewhat hidden. There was an attempt was made.
Yeah, a friend of mine, thank you for that. A friend of mine, his father was Jewish and his mother was not. He was, the Chabad band was there, and so they invited him in, and they were wrapping him in the tefillin and all. But as soon as they found out that his father was Jewish and his mother was not, they quickly unwrapped the tefillin and kicked him out.
Yeah.
He's very much Jewish. But anyway.
The Chabadniks have learned the don't ask, don't tell policy as sometimes the best way to keep yourself from getting in trouble with the locals, or finding out things that you don't want to find out after the fact.
Yep, there's a whole community of secular Jews who love the idea of being Jewish. We have here a whole group in Lambertville that every Friday afternoon or evening they text or on Facebook that they Shabbat Shalom and with smiley faces, yet they go nowhere near the shul.
Yeah. No, the range of Jewish practice within a shul is broad, and within a community with multiple shuls is even broader. And globally, it is a very wide tent. And there are people who say that parts of the group are not under the tent at all. But we really are. And sorting out how to work together, to live together, to be a more united Jewish people, is a welcoming Jewish people is something that I wish for us as a whole. I know that many of us here, many of us who might ever listen to this, are engaged in that work, maybe simply by existing, are engaged in the work of unifying the Jewish people and broadening the understanding of where the Jewish tent covers.
We thank you so much for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Stop the recording.